My name is Lorenz Gude. This YouTube is based on a talk I gave to the Jung Society of Western Australia in June 2018. It seemed to me and my audience that it covered a lot in a bit over an hour, and I decided to break it into 3 parts. This is part 1. By way of background, in my working life, I was an academic and a therapist, and in retirement I've been able to return to the interests I had at university, where I majored in English with minors in art history and comparative religion. Jung, more than anyone else I studied, has been the most helpful across those 3 areas of interest and over the course of my life. My approach in this talk is basically academic, but as you will probably notice, it is mixed with a practical concern for religious and mystical experience. That is, it is mostly from the head, but I hope you will find it not entirely out of touch with the heart. And for my religious friends, I hope they don't find me too heretical. Let's begin. On the face of it, Liber Novus, in Latin, the New Book, or as we know it, the Red Book, is a recording of visionary experience. It can also be seen as a descent into the underworld, into hell. As Sonyu Shamdasani put it, introducing it in 2009 at the Library of Congress, after living with it for 13 years, translating and preparing it for publication. Unlike the previous visions of hell that Shamdasani cites, specifically those of Dante, Swedenborg, and Blake, the Red Book has only been published a century after its creation. In his time, Dante had to use his great literary skill to transform his visionary experiences into epic poetry and carefully exclude any material that could be considered heretical by the early Renaissance church authorities. About 450 years later, in Enlightenment England, Emanuel Swedenborg, a Swedish scientist, was able to publish his visions of heaven and hell as religious vision, without attracting religious persecution or entirely losing credibility for his scientific work. About 30 years later, Blake published The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, in part as a response to Swedenborg, but seriously presented as both religious revelation and as art. Blake illustrated the text, and he and his wife hand-colored it. By the time Jung began recording his visions in the Red Book, science had established its methods and authority, such that visionary experience had no place, and Jung realized that even though he saw his visions as psychological facts, there was no obvious way to present them scientifically. Still, that was what Jung wanted to do. So Jung did not publish the Red Book as either art or religious revelation, yet in many ways it resembles both. He might have led a spiritual movement, like his contemporary Rudolf Steiner, but he was much more interested in explaining existing religions to a modern audience, and when invited to publish it as art, he also refused. Looking back from the late 50s to when he was working on the Red Book at the time of World War I, he reports asking himself, quote, "What am I really doing? Certainly this is nothing to do with science. But then, what is it?" An inner female voice replied, "That is art." To which Jung retorted, "No, it is not art. On the contrary, it is nature." End quote. Nature. I think that spontaneous response indicates that Jung fundamentally felt that what happens inside us, in our psyches, is part of nature and worthy of scientific study. It is worth remembering that modern science separated itself from scholasticism in the late Middle Ages by insisting on direct observation of the book of nature to answer questions about the world. As we shall see, Jung brought that original scientific intent to his patients and their inner world. He was a trained clinician, and he recorded his inner experiences in the spirit of science by creating a faithful record of what he experienced, the images he saw, voices he heard, and the figures he encountered. As a psychiatrist, Jung recognized the danger of deliberately entering the substratum of consciousness and was only able to avoid what he felt was a potential schizophrenic break by working with his visions at night and grounding himself during the day by throwing himself fully into his professional work and personal life. Lance Owens, a Los Angeles medical doctor and Jung scholar, puts it this way, and I quote, "As a clinical investigator in 1913, Jung fully realized that one's own psyche was the only soul offering itself for immediate, direct, and intimate observation. Empirically, all else was hearsay, not observation." Close quote. The Red Book is episodic and has no conventional overall plot because, I believe, it truly is a clinical record first and does not extensively recast the material to create a coherent narrative, artistic or religious. For example, J.R.R. Tolkien discovered in himself a fully formed elven language the night after he lost a close friend in the Battle of the Somme, but it was only many years later that he was able to transmute his visionary experiences into literature. However, as Shamdasani points out in his introduction, Jung's visions are followed in the Red Book by his first attempts to analyze what is happening to him psychologically. But these initial explanations, as we shall see, remain directly engaged in the actual visionary events and figures, and do not surround them with fictional additions or distance them with conceptual language. After 1920, Jung would extend that analytic approach into his theoretical work, starting with psychological types in 1921, and develop the now familiar conceptual framework for which he is known. Concepts such as archetype, ego and self, persona and shadow, animus and anima, and the overarching structure of growth toward wholeness in the process he called individuation. Ironically, the evidence Jung had for his theories sprang from a place that seems to me entirely outside modern philosophic and scientific epistemology. For now, let's just think of it as the ancient prophetic way of knowing, extending back indefinitely in time to the dawn of humanity, and found in the world's sacred texts, but being observed by a modern scientific mind with the intent of understanding it in the spirit of science, not to create a great work of art or inspire religiously, or even create a New Age movement outside psychology. While Shamdasani believes Jung intended to publish the work at some stage, he remained conflicted about it and stopped working on it in 1928. However, if he simply wanted a clinical record for his own use, he would have left the material as he first recorded it in ordinary Swiss school notebooks called the Black Books, and not have transcribed it into the Red Book, and labored long and hard to put it into the form of an illuminated medieval manuscript. The particular choice of that medieval form, normally reserved for very rare and important works of high spiritual significance, clearly seems to indicate a combination of religious and artistic intent. But I suspect Jung saw the record of his exploration of his own psyche as of great importance because he felt such material, for years apparent in his patients as psychological facts, had the potential to advance psychology as a science. In the end, he did not publish because he himself thought the material fell outside the norms of modern science. Still, the Red Book was prepared to be seen, and he did, in fact, exhibit it to his patients and encourage them to work with their own inner material in similar ways. Historically, the Red Book is the first demonstration of the technique we today call active imagination, which many therapists continue to develop in a variety of ways to help patients let the unconscious mind express itself. The way Jung used it privately with patients demonstrates that he wanted it to be seen and to use the Red Book to help others do their own work. He states very clearly early on in the Red Book, quote, "This play that I witnessed is my play, not your play. It is my secret, not yours. You cannot imitate me. My secret remains virginal, and my mysteries are inviolable. They belong to me and cannot belong to you. You have your own." Close quote. At the same time, Jung knows his individual visions have collective value. But unlike a prophet or even an artist, he does not impose the collective material coming through him on his audience in any of the usual ways, but invites us to have our own experiences of our inner world, knowing full well that if we succeed in confronting the unconscious, we will experience both individual and collective material. The injunction to have your own experience brings into sharp relief Jung's problematic relationship to conventional religion, which has two conflicting impulses, one toward collective unity of belief and consistency, and the other toward the mystical individual religious experience. Jung certainly encourages the latter when he says, "You must have your own." Yet the reaction of the conventionally religious remains mixed to this day. It should be noted that Jung understood the power of a unified system of beliefs and symbols, and would initially send his Roman Catholic patients back to the church to try to work out their lives within the symbol system of the church. Still, many Catholics and Catholic clergy have found Jung useful, and others have serious reservations. In part, I think, because they know that religious experience is not ultimately accessible to the intellect alone. So they know Jung's conceptual system can only take one so far on the spiritual path. For others, it is that very conceptual system that has initiated them into a life of spiritual seeking, and I would include myself in that group. The publication of Jung's own original visionary material confirms that Jung's conceptual work is grounded in direct inner experience of a kind that is normally thought of as religious experience, but recorded with empirical intent and a scientific attitude. This tension between religion and mysticism, science and the psychological fact of inner vision in Jung's work is brought right out in the open by the publication of the Red Book. To give a graphic sense of one of the ways Jung viewed the unconscious mind, here is a diagram that Jung used in his seminars on Kundalini during the 30s, taken from Barbara Hanna's personal memoir of Jung. I have reapplied the original colors and added the labels for the layers. The structure here is one of increasingly broad collective layers as one goes down into the unconscious. However, my concern here is to show that Jung created the Red Book in part as a record of the material that came up from these collective layers through him as an individual, but which he taught is accessible in widely varying specific instances to each of us. Thus, Jung's Red Book demonstrates a profoundly difficult aspect of human experience, that our inner experiences are only accessible to us as individuals, and at the same time, the deeper one goes into these inner experiences, the more collective they become. Rather than say Jung invented the collective unconscious, it is more useful to say he was the first to describe it from the point of view of modern Western consciousness, from which the scientific worldview is inseparable. It is useful to note at this point that the German word for science is Wissenschaft, which, while including what we mean in English by science, also includes the more general idea of inquiry, in the sense that philosophy is a field of inquiry. Jung knew perfectly well what experimental science was, and it engaged in it using Wundt's word association test in the early years of the 20th century to probe his patients at the Bergholtzy Asylum, systematically recording which words caused a delay in response times. What is important to notice is that Jung brings the modern scientific worldview to psychology, both as an outside observer and as self-inquiry. By modern worldview, I mean a post-Darwinian, post-Nietzschean worldview that emphatically favors a rational, naturalistic understanding of the world. He knew full well the contradictory position this put him in, observing in 1940, and I quote, "The psyche is the object of psychology, and, fatally enough, at the same time its subject. There is no getting away from this fact." Close quote. It is precisely the difference between this familiar modern worldview and the religious past that Jung experienced in himself and wanted to address. He had been aware since childhood of two sides of his personalities in himself, which he called his number one and number two personalities. Number one was the ordinary modern person, and the other was a far older person with memories of the 18th century and to whom powerful dreams and paranormal experiences occurred. The two personalities come into direct confrontation early in the Red Book as a conflict between the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths. Quote, "I have learned that in addition to the spirit of this time, there is still another spirit at work, namely that which rules the depths of everything contemporary. The spirit of this time would like to know of use and value. I also thought this way, and my humanity still thinks this way. But that other spirit forces me nevertheless to speak beyond justification, use, and meaning. Filled with human pride and blinded by the presumptuous spirit of the times, I long sought to hold that other spirit away from me. But I did not consider that the spirit of the depths, from time immemorial, and for all the future, possesses a greater power than the spirit of this time, who changes with the generations. The spirit of the depths has subjugated all pride and arrogance to the power of judgment. He took away my belief in science. He robbed me of the joy of explaining and ordering things, and let devotion to the ideals of this time die out in me. He forced me down to the last and simplest things." Close quote. Later, in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung spoke of the moment as a boy he discovered the two parts of himself while being told off for disobedience by a friend's rich manufacturer father. Quote, "Then, to my intense confusion, it occurred to me that I was actually two different persons. One of them was the schoolboy who could not grasp algebra and was far from sure of himself. The other was an important man, a high authority, not to be trifled with, as powerful and influential as this manufacturer. This other was an old man who lived in the 18th century, wore buckled shoes and a white wig, and went driving in a fly with high concave rear wheels, between which the box was suspended on springs and leather straps. Close quote. Jung's mother also had a number 2 personality, and Jung was aware of it. When he was a university student living at home, a table spontaneously split, and later a knife shattered with a loud noise for no apparent reason. Quote, "My mother and my sister had been in the room when the sudden report made them jump. My mother's number 2 looked at me meaningfully, but I could find nothing to say, as I was completely at a loss and could offer no explanation of what had happened. And this was all the more annoying as I had to admit I was profoundly impressed. Why and how had the table split and the knife shattered?" Close quote. This passage forced me to realize that I too had a number 2 personality, and so did my mother, particularly in relation to things we both knew lay outside normal explanation, but we acknowledged with looks, not words. Most significant was her habit of recruiting me into her efforts to save dying calves, with liberal doses of whiskey and eggs on the practical side, followed by our holding the calves on our laps and dragging them back from the edge of death from someplace she managed to convey, which was located deep inside both our body and our spirit. I grew up knowing I could heal animals, but it took me until I was in my late 40s to recognize I had some ability to heal people and train in Rosen method bodywork. Jung was far more conscious of his ability to heal people with his number 2 personality, and discovered early on at the Burgholtze that his number 2 could effect a very rapid cure of some patients, leaving his number 1 personality the tricky task of inventing a medically acceptable explanation of how he had done it to report to his colleagues. Jung also recognized that children develop number 2 personalities, and that these children exhibited unusual maturity from an early age. He would later assert that the number 2 is the basis of what he called the self. The spirit of our time, perhaps more than ever, makes it difficult for people to credit the idea that there exists within themselves something of higher value, and dissuades them from searching for it inwardly.